All right, lecture number 20. Let's talk about labor and delivery. All right, several things have to occur to prepare a female for going into labor. Some of them are kind of interesting. The fetus, during the last few weeks of pregnancy, the fetus begins secreting cortisol, the same cortisol hormone that you learned about way back at the beginning of the semester that's involved in long-term stress responses in the body. But when the fetus secretes this, it actually stimulates the placenta to ramp up its estrogen production. And then why that is important. So estrogen is a signaling molecule that stimulates various things to happen. The increased estrogen causes an increased production of oxytocin receptors. So this is going to be on the smooth muscle tissues of the wall of the uterus. In your myometrium, oxytocin receptors are going to be expressed on the surface, displayed on the surface of those cells. So those smooth muscle cells are getting ready to receive the oxytocin signal from the posterior pituitary. And then interestingly, surfactant protein A from the fetal lungs, this is pretty interesting, but it stimulates softening of the cervix. So the cervical tissues, of course, have to start to soften to prepare for the head of the fetus to move down and engage and prepare to enter the birth canal or the vaginal canal during delivery. Okay, and then also fetal oxytocin. So the fetus actually produces some oxytocin itself, and that communicates with the placenta. It stimulates the placenta to produce prostaglandins, and we've seen the term prostaglandins multiple times throughout the semester. These are local signaling molecules that play different roles in different parts of the body since they act locally. But oxytocin and prostaglandins together will stimulate powerful uterine muscle contractions. And that's when we're going to wind up entering into labor. This diagram from your textbook summarizes some of this. Estrogen from the placenta, as that gets ramped up at the end of pregnancy, that stimulates oxytocin receptors to be produced in the smooth muscle cells of the myometrium in the uterus. So they're getting ready to respond to oxytocin. The fetus secretes oxytocin. The posterior pituitary and mom begins to secrete oxytocin, and that is going to stimulate the uterus to contract. And actually, the oxytocin, as I just mentioned, also stimulates the placenta to make prostaglandins, and those also signal smooth muscle cell contractions within the myometrium. So this is a positive feedback type system. Those contractions, there are stretch receptors in the uterus as well, so sensory nervous tissues that detect the stretching of the uterus, and those send signals up to the hypothalamus to produce more oxytocin and have that secreted out of the posterior pituitary gland. So you've got positive feedback going on. So labor is going to be a positive feedback process. So throughout most of your tenure in Biology 201 and 202, you hear about negative feedback, where if something is increasing, it gets reversed so that it decreases. If it decreases too much, you reverse it so that it increases back upward, things like body temperature and blood pressure. Going into labor is an example of positive feedback. You start having muscular contractions and they get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger until you've completed a process or a function, in this case delivering this infant. So contractions of the uterus will stimulate the secretion of more of these the oxytocin hormone and the prostaglandins that wind up stimulating even more uterine contractions. Okay, stages of labor. So dilation, you've heard about the cervix dilating before. And of course, if you've ever experienced childbirth or you've been around somebody who's going through childbirth, you know that can be the longest stage of labor, taking 6 to 12 hours or more in some cases. And the contractions that are dilating the cervix are initially fairly weak. They become more regular, more vigorous, more rapid. And the cervix, the tissues of the cervix efface or thin and flatten out, and the cervix is able to dilate. It has to dilate to 10 centimeters. You've probably heard that before if you've ever been around anybody having a baby. So that's around 4 inches across in diameter. So that's quite an increase in size for the cervix. The amnion has to rupture, and you've probably, you guys no doubt have heard about a woman's amniotic sac rupturing before and amniotic fluid coming pouring out after that happens. Engagement, when you hear about the head of the fetus being engaged, that means the head has entered down into the true part of the pelvis, the bowl of the pelvis, and everything is then prepared for the infant to begin moving through the vaginal canal and on out of the body. And so that stage is called expulsion, where you have very strong contractions, and those contractions of the uterus squeeze the poor little baby here down through the vaginal canal. And those are going to happen about every 2 to 3 minutes. Each contraction lasts about a minute or so long until we squeeze the poor little baby out. And then finally we have our placental stage. So after, as you guys know, after the infant is born, the placenta has to detach, and that occurs due to continuing strong contractions of the uterus. And the umbilical cord, of course, has been cut, and that's still attached to the placenta, so those contents have to be expelled out of the mother as well. So that's called the placental stage. This is also referred to as the afterbirth that follows the birth of the infant. All right, how about our newborn infant? The infant, of course, has a big shock. It's been floating around in that nice warm amniotic fluid, just kind of hanging out, and now it's got to adjust to extra uterine life. So extra means outside the uterus. The period for the first 4 weeks right after birth is called the neonatal period. That's your key period of adaptation for the newborn baby after birth. And you've probably heard of this before, the APGAR score, which is given to a newborn infant. And that's just to assess the health and the viability of the newborn infant. So 0 to 2 points are assigned for heart rate, respiration, color, muscle tone, and reflexes of the infant. And so if the infant receives a score of 8 to 10, that's considered healthy. If it's below 8, the infant's going to have to be monitored a lot to make sure that it begins to develop properly. What stimulates breathing? So the infant hasn't needed to use its lungs before now because it's been exchanging its oxygen gas and carbon dioxide with the mother's blood in the placenta. And so what it actually is, remember how we learned when we were covering the respiratory system that really it's the CO2 levels in our body fluids that have more control over respiration than oxygen levels. Your oxygen levels actually have to be pretty low before they really have any impact over your breathing rate. But newborn baby pops out, and the cells in that infant have been doing cellular respiration all along, and CO2 is a waste product of cellular respiration. So it's gonna, if the infant needs to start breathing right away to expel that CO2. So before you start breathing right after birth, CO2 levels in your bloodstream and body fluids go up pretty quickly. That leads to respiratory acidosis, and that's going to go through those processes we learned about where the respiratory control centers get triggered to, hey, let's go, increase the breathing and rate and depth. And so the infant will take his or her first inspiration. The first 6 to 8 hours after the birth of a newborn are considered to be an unstable period with alternating periods of activity and sleep. And the vital signs have to be monitored because they may be irregular during this time. But soon that stabilizes, and as you guys know, a newborn infant sleeps a lot, wakes every 3 to 4 hours, wants to feed, goes to the bathroom, and kind of stays on that type of schedule for a while. All right, so we have been through the story of what it takes to birth us a new baby. And the very last lecture for Biology 202, we're actually going to talk about how we prevent the conception and the development of a new baby. So lecture 21 will cover birth control, and that will actually finish up the info that we're going to cover for Unit 5 and our Biology 202 course.